They tore down my family's bridge, then left an HOA sign where my grandfather's name once stood. They thought I was just another old rancher guarding a patch of land, until they tore down the bridge my family built 3 generations ago and planted an HOA sign in its place. I didn't fight with anger, I fought with law, and by the time they realized who they were up against, it was already too late. The sun leaned low over Redwater Creek, pouring honey-colored light across the valley. Dust climbed from the ranch road as my pickup eased to a crawl, tires whispering over washboard gravel. The cottonwoods opened, and where a wooden span should have caught the light, lay torn and scattered, splintered timbers, iron bolts like teeth in the mud, hand-cut rails snapped. I killed the engine. The quiet that followed wasn't silence. It was absence. There had been a bridge here for 3 generations. My grandfather laid the first beams when the country still smelled of horses and green lumber. My father replaced the decking after a spring flood. I restored it 10 years ago and fixed a small bronze plate to the inner stringer, Carter Bridge, registered 1957, so the National Register paperwork had a mark on the wood itself. I touched the empty air where the handrail should have been. A bright orange sign flapped from a willow branch. Unauthorized structure removed, Lakeside Ridge Association. Its edges curled from sun and spray. The HOA crest, 2 tidy leaves around a roofline, looked smug as a stamp on a bill you never owed. No caution tape, no county seal, just the color of insult beating in the wind. I stepped into the verge and walked the ragged line of ruin. The creek ran clear, carrying matchsticks of what used to be deckboards. A cedar post bobbed once and slid under. I knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the cut face of a beam. The smell was fresh. Whatever they'd done it within a day. The saw left chatter marks a slow craftsman would never accept. I took out my phone and started what the law calls a contemporaneous record. Lenses don't argue. I shot wide, bank to bank, then slow pans over the splinters, the waterline. The tire ruts ground into silt where someone had backed heavy equipment to the edge. I tagged coordinates, time, weather. I photographed the orange sign in place, then detached it and photographed the bark beneath to show the lack of any official notice. I measured the saw kerf and the distance between ruts. The wind shifted and carried a faint scent of chain oil and diesel. Sunlight blinked off something in the current, a washer spinning like a coin. I waded mid-calf and plucked it out, dropped it into a bag I keep for days like this. A ranch teaches you to save things: wire, hinges, stories. The bench of a courtroom teaches the same about facts. On the far bank, a cottonwood wore 2 clean wounds where ribbon had been tied and torn away. Fresh orange fibers clung to the bark. 3 tread patterns crossed the damp silt, one with a broken lug repeating every 7 feet. I angled the phone until late light threw the impressions into relief. If you stood here, you'd have seen absence as a presence. That bridge wasn't just wood and bolts. It carried calving seasons and school mornings, wedding parties and funeral flowers. It was our handshake with our own ground. And here it was more than memory. Listed, inspected, protected. I climbed the bank and photographed the sign up close. LRA Compliance Division. We live miles outside their boundary. The nearest cul-de-sac sits a half-hour east. Their bylaws stop with their covenants. My deed predates both by longer than some of their board members have been alive. A pickup eased to a stop on the county road. Marcus Reed leaned from the window, brim shading his eyes. "You all right, Judge?" he called. "I've been better," I said. He parked, came down the slope, and stood at my shoulder, the way a man stands at a grave. Marcus worked this ranch long before I ever owned a tie. He can fix a gate with baling wire and a prayer, and he can read tire tracks the way a librarian reads spines. "They did it quick," he said. "Lifted with a loader, cut mid-span so it wouldn't roll." He tapped a shard with his boot. "What I don't see is paperwork." "That's because there isn't any." I showed him the placard and the empty bark where it had hung. I took another photo with his finger in frame for scale. He didn't ask why. He knows I don't make trouble. I make records. We followed the ruts to the water's edge. He pointed where the bank had been shaved to give axles room. They weren't just passing through, he said. They set up. I stood quiet and let the place speak. Sound carries differently when a bridge is gone. The current runs unbroken. Voices don't come back from the far side. The light thickened from gold to hay-colored. Somewhere a screen door closed. Back at the truck, I pulled a manila envelope from behind the seat. Maps, registry printouts, the 1957 letter acknowledging historic status with my grandfather's careful signature. I set the HOA placard on top and photographed the stack. Authority that exists and authority pretending to. I wrote the date in the corner in my courtroom hand. The window showed me a man in a black hat and dark coat, dust on the sleeves, water on the boots. It also showed me the other truth. A federal judge who had spent the morning in Helena reminding two parties that rules are not decorations. I didn't say that out loud. Titles don't fix fences. Work does. Next move? Marcus asked. We don't move, Ossione said. We gather. We mounted 2 trail cameras in the cottonwoods and one under the remains of the east abutment. I flagged the tire marks with discrete stakes. I recorded a slow bank-to-bank walk so any later change would stand out. A glint in the ditch pulled me off the path. I bent and found a narrow strip of painted metal, white meant to pass for nothing. Stenciled on the back was a fragment of a company name I recognized from invoices pinned to the HOA board at the feed store. It joined the washer in the bag. The creek threw a last flare of light as the sun slipped behind the hills. I stood where the center span used to make a shadow and thought of my grandfather carrying the first plank. You keep a soul, place alive by crossing it, he used to say. People forget. They draw lines on paper and think that's the same as land. The orange sign snapped in the wind. I looked at its stamped letters, then at the ruin it tried to bless, and felt something settle like a gate dropping into its latch. Anger is useful when it's put to work. I slid the sign into the envelope with the papers that outweigh it, and tucked the whole thing behind the seat. As I turned the key, Marcus asked what was already forming in my mind. Who told them they could do this? I let the engine idle and watched the creek run where footsteps should have crossed. Good question, I said. It rode with us down the road, steady as water finding its level. By the time we hit the county highway, the day was sliding into that gray space between afternoon and evening. Dust hung in the mirrors like smoke. Marcus didn't say much. He didn't have to. Both of us were raised in places where silence spoke louder than words, and right now it was shouting. The town of Redwater isn't much more than a diner, a feed store, and a handful of offices pretending to be important. But just past the grain elevator, where the asphalt shines new and the trees look ornamental instead of wild, sits the Lakeside Ridge HOA office. A glass and stone box dropped onto Montana soil like it forgot where it was supposed to land. I pulled in slow. The parking lot was spotless, striped perfect, no dust allowed. The sign out front said Lakeside Ridge Association, building a better community. I stared at those words a beat too long. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and money, the kind of place where boots squeak because the floor's too clean. A young woman sat behind a counter, tapping on a keyboard with one hand and sipping iced coffee with the other. Her eyes barely lifted when I stepped in. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that meant she'd rather not. "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm here to speak to whoever authorized the demolition of the bridge on my ranch." That got her attention. She blinked, turned her head slightly. "Are you a member of the Lakeside Ridge Association, sir?" "No," I said. "That's the point." Before she could respond, a voice drifted from the hallway. Smooth, commanding, practiced in smiling while cutting throats. "Is there a problem here?" She straightened. "Mr. Remy is here about a bridge." The woman who appeared from the corridor looked like she'd stepped out of a glossy brochure. Neat hair, burnt orange blazer, clipboard tucked tight under her arm. "Bethany Whitfield, HOA president," the nameplate on the wall announced. She smiled like a politician caught mid-photo. "Mr. Remy, isn't it? I heard you've had some concerns about our compliance team." "Concerns?" I repeated, tasting the word. "That's one way to put it. Well, first, let me say I appreciate your care for the community." She gestured toward a framed map behind her, color-coded parcels stretching across the valley like a quilt someone stitched without looking. We had multiple complaints from residents about a structure crossing the creek. Safety hazard. Non-compliant. So our team took initiative. I studied the map, my jaw tightening. My ranch wasn't colored brown, the way private parcels should be. It was shaded blue, HOA blue. "That's not your jurisdiction," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "I understand it wasn't, but our updated zoning plan expands the lakeside boundary to include the adjoining creek corridor. We're improving access for emergency services, reducing environmental risk." I cut her off with a glance. "You mean expanding your fee base?" Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes flashed annoyance. "We believe it's in everyone's interest. Growth is inevitable, Judge." She caught herself, realizing she'd said too much. "Sorry, Mr. Remy." I didn't correct her. The word hung there like a loose wire. "Do you have a permit from the county?" I asked. "Our compliance division handled the process," she said. "They coordinated with Ridge Construction. I assume the necessary paperwork was filed." "Assume," I said. "That's brave." She crossed her arms. "Look, Mr. Remy, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We're neighbors, not enemies. I'm sure once we bring your land into the community plan, you'll see the benefits: shared maintenance, improved roads, property value protection." "And what if I say no?" Her smile sharpened. "Then we'll proceed under community development ordinances. You'll receive notice soon enough." I looked past her at the receptionist, who suddenly found something very interesting on her screen. Then I turned back. "Bethany, I'd advise your board to review federal property statutes before your next initiative. That bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was registered, protected." Her expression shifted. Curiosity wrapped in arrogance. "Protected? By who?" "By me," I said, and walked out. Outside, the wind had picked up, lifting grit across the parking lot. Marcus leaned against the truck, watching through the windshield. "Well?" he asked. "They've redrawn the map," I said, colored outside their lines. "Then we redraw it back." "Not yet," I told him. "First, we let them hang themselves with their own paperwork." He nodded slowly, like he'd seen this movie before. "You really think she's behind it?" "She's the kind who doesn't swing the hammer," I said, opening the door. "She just gives the order and calls it progress." We drove home through the long ribbon of road between pasture and lake. The wind rattled the barbed wire, low and restless. My father used to say land remembers. Every trespass, every lie, every cut, it all settles in the soil and waits. The sun dropped behind the hills, and by the time we hit the gate, the world had turned the color of old copper. I shut off the engine. The creek glimmered faintly beyond the field, a strip of moving silver. Marcus opened the fence and paused, scanning the tree line. "You think they'll come back?" "They already have," I said, pointing to the distant ridge. A new post, orange marked, glowed faintly against the dark, too fresh to be old. We stood there a while, the night settling around us, the sound of crickets mixing with the quiet rush of water where a bridge should have stood. Somewhere, paper was already being printed, Maps updated, signatures forged. But they'd misjudged the man who'd signed the last page. When Marcus finally headed back to the bunkhouse, I stayed. The stars stretched wide, scattered across the sky like nails on black timber. The creek whispered below, carrying a language older than the town itself, steady, stubborn, unwilling to bend. I crouched by the water, tracing the reflection of the moon against the fractured current. The absence of that bridge was more than loss. It was insult carved in silence. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and moved down the bank. The ruts from the demolition crew were still visible, fresh, deep, angled toward the ridge road. Someone in a hurry, someone certain they wouldn't be stopped. I took out a tape measure and recorded the track width, then followed it to where it merged with older tire lines near the cattle path. They'd backed a flatbed in from the east entrance, the one that meets the county road. Not many knew that route even existed. That told me one thing. They'd studied my land before moving in. The next morning came thin and gray. Mist curled low over the pasture as I brewed coffee on the porch. Marcus joined me, eyes still heavy with sleep, but sharp beneath. "They're not done," he said. "I know." "Then what's next?" "Proof," I said. "Paper against paper." By mid-morning, we were knee-deep in the archives of the ranch's storage loft. Dust floated in sunlight cutting through the cracks of the tin roof. Boxes labeled survey maps, maintenance logs, and federal registry. "Funny, Mom?" 1950s. I found what I needed in a weathered binder wrapped in cloth. The bridge's original registry letter from the Department of the Interior. My grandfather's signature at the bottom, neat as a gavel strike. The seal still faintly embossed. I laid it flat on the table, smoothing the creases with my palm. Marcus leaned over. "That's going to make their lawyer choke." "Not yet," I said. "Let them talk first." After lunch, we installed 3 trail cameras along the creek, 2 facing upstream, 1 tucked in the willow line across the demolished span, each synced to my phone. If they came back, I'd know before they left. Marcus set motion sensors near the ridge gate, camouflaged under brush. The faint red blink of readiness pulsed like a heartbeat. The rest of the day stretched quiet. Too quiet. The kind of calm that presses against your ribs, waiting to snap. I spent it cataloging evidence, dates, photos, registry scans, all backed up twice. The legal system doesn't run on emotion. It runs on order, and order was what I had. By sundown, clouds rolled in from the west, dark and heavy, dragging wind across the valley. The kind of wind that warns you. I stepped outside as the first drops hit the porch roof. The scent of wet sage filled the air. Across the field, lightning flashed, quick and white, revealing something near the creek. "Marcus!" I called, grabbing the flashlight. We rode down in the ATV, tires sliding through mud, the rain thick as gravel. When we reached the creek bed, the beam caught movement. A figure bent low near the remains of the bridge. Then another. 3 in total. They wore rain jackets, hoods up, flashlights angled toward the ground. Surveyors again, or pretending to be. One lifted a stake and drove it into the mud, marking something. The other 2 scribbled notes on clipboards. My pulse steadied the way it does before a verdict. I killed the engine and let the rain mask our steps. We moved closer until we could hear them. "They said the new line runs 10 yards west," one man muttered. "Boss wants it mapped tonight." "Boss?" I whispered. Marcus's brow tightened. We waited until the nearest one turned his back. Then I hit the ATV's headlights full. The glare sliced through the storm, freezing them like deer on a 2-lane. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of them dropped his clipboard. I stepped forward, rain sliding off my hat brim. "Evening, gentlemen." The tallest one found his voice. We're with Ridge Development, contracted by the Lakeside Association, just surveying public access lines. Public? I repeated. You're standing on federally registered private land. He hesitated, looked at the others. That can't be right. Our maps. Your maps are lies, I said, lifting my phone. The camera light blinked red. Smile for evidence. They turned pale under the floodlight. One muttered, "Let's go," and they bolted, splashing through the shallows, vanishing into the dark line of trees. Marcus laughed once, low. Guess they didn't want to stick around for questions. No, I said, but they left answers. I picked up the dropped clipboard. Rain smeared the ink, but a letterhead was still visible. Lakeside Ridge Expansion Project, Phase 2. Back at the ranch, I placed it on the desk beside the registry letter. The contrast was almost poetic. Heritage against greed. The ink of generations versus the ink of convenience. Around midnight, the storm finally broke. I sat by the window, watching the creek glow faintly under the rising moon. The bridge's shadow still lingered across the water, like memory refusing to fade. My phone buzzed softly. One of the trail cameras had triggered. The image came through grainy but clear. A black SUV parked by the ridge road, headlights off. No logo, no plates. Just waiting. Marcus's voice came from the doorway. You think they'll come again? They will, I said, and when they do, we'll have more than photos. We'll have motive. He nodded, half smile beneath the worry. You're not letting this go, are you? Not until they rebuild what they broke, I said, and maybe a few illusions with it. Outside, the creek whispered back, steady as ever, carrying pieces of the past toward whatever justice tomorrow might bring. The next morning rose clear and cold, a deceptive calm after the night's storm. Mist hung over the pasture, softening the outlines of fences and cattle. The bridge's remains gleamed wet in the early light, pieces of timber half buried in the silt like bones after a battle. From the porch, I could see the waterline already receding, leaving new scars along the bank. Nature always remembered, but it didn't forgive. Marcus came up from the barn, coffee steaming in one hand, a clipboard in the other. Checked the cameras, he said. No movement since the SUV last night. Maybe they took the hint. Or they're regrouping, I said, setting down my mug. People like that don't stop when you catch them. They stop when you corner them. He looked toward the creek, then back at me. You going into town again? Yeah. Need to file copies of the registry letter with the county office before someone loses them. He nodded. I'll keep watch here. By the time I reached Redwater, the town had shaken off its early stillness. Trucks lined Main Street, the air thick with diesel and sawdust from the mill. I parked beside the courthouse, boots striking the steps that still smelled faintly of varnish. Inside, the clerk, a thin man named Harold with glasses too big for his face, looked up from his desk. Morning, Judge Rem. Sorry, Mr. Remy, he said, catching himself mid-word. Morning, Harold. Need these entered into county records under property registry maintenance. I handed over a folder, copies of the original bridge registration, photographs, and the HOA sign. He flipped through them, brows lifting. They tore this down? That's a protected site. They did, I said, and they'll answer for it. But for now, I need time-stamped proof it was filed again today. Harold stamped each page with a heavy thud. There. Official as sunrise. Appreciate it. As I turned to leave, a voice called from the hall. Mr. Remy? I turned. It was Sheriff McKay, broad-shouldered, gray around the temples, wearing the same leather jacket he'd had since his deputy days. Heard about your bridge, he said. You got someone in your sights? Let's just say the HOA's been playing architect on land they don't own. McKay's jaw tightened. Bethany Whitfield's crew? Her signature's not on the paperwork, yet, but I'll get there. He leaned against the wall. Be careful, Jake. Folks like her don't act alone. Developers have been sniffing around these valleys for months, pretending to be civic do-gooders. Money talks louder than fences. I gave him a nod. Money talks, but the law writes the transcript. By the time I got home, the wind had shifted. The air tasted dry, electric. Marcus was out by the North Ridge, repairing a gate hinge. I walked toward the main barn, the metallic tang of motor oil cutting through the afternoon heat. Then I smelled something, else, sharp, chemical, wrong. "Marcus!" I shouted. But before the word finished leaving my mouth, the world split open with a sound like thunder made of iron. A burst of flame leapt from behind the ridge, orange against the pale sky. The barn windows rattled from the shockwave. I ran, boots pounding the dirt, the wind dragging smoke through the grass. The tool shed, my father's old shed, was burning. Marcus was already there, hose in hand, fighting the flames that snapped like flags in a storm. "It's fuel," he coughed. "They used something. Accelerant." We sprayed until the water line ran dry. The shed groaned once and folded inward, the roof collapsing in a hiss of embers. I could taste ash on my tongue. When the smoke thinned, what remained was a blackened skeleton of lumber and warped metal. "Get the camera," I said. Marcus retrieved the trail cam from the nearest post. We replayed the footage right there, crouched in the mud. The timestamp flickered. 10:42 a.m. A dark truck pulling up behind the ridge. Two figures stepping out. One carried a gas can. The other held something that glinted like a flare. 30 seconds later, white light, then static. Marcus exhaled slow. "That's arson. No mistaking it." "Federal property, registered landmark," I said. "They just turned vandalism into a felony." We transferred the footage to my laptop and sent it directly to Hannah Thomas, the DOJ investigator I'd contacted earlier about the bridge registry. Within minutes, my phone rang. "Judge Remy?" Her voice was calm but clipped. "I received your email. That footage is solid evidence. Don't engage them directly. We'll coordinate with state enforcement." "They're escalating," I said. "If they think fire will scare me off, they've never been to trial." She paused. "Understood. We'll move fast. In the meantime, keep documentation secure. No confrontations." After the call, Marcus and I stood in the ruin's shadow, the wind tugging at the ash. "They're getting desperate," he said. "Desperation leaves fingerprints," I replied. That night, the ridge was silent again. Too silent. The trail cams blinked, small red eyes watching the dark. Inside the house, I filed the footage, copies of every letter, every timestamp. My desk was covered in manila folders, each labeled in black ink. Bridge, trespass, arson. When I finally stepped outside, the moon hung low, fat and pale. The creek murmured softly in the distance, its surface catching pieces of starlight. Fire had scarred the ridge, but water still moved, unbroken. Marcus joined me on the porch, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. "You think they'll try again?" "They'll try something," I said. "But next time the law will be waiting." The wind shifted through the burned timbers, making them creak like voices half-remembered. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, 3 short cries and silence. The ranch listened, holding its breath. The smell of smoke still tangled in the grass. I watched the glowing dots of the cameras across the field, steady, patient. The same patience I'd learned from a lifetime of rulings and rainstorms. The same patience that comes before the hammer falls. Morning came without sound. Just the hush of dew soaking the grass and the faint scent of smoke still tangled in the air. The fire on the ridge had been contained, but its shadow lingered. Every time the wind shifted, I caught the faint memory of burning oak and gasoline. Marcus was already at the kitchen table when I came down, sorting through a pile of printed photos. "Pulled all the footage from last night," he said, sliding one toward me. Nothing new, but that SUV drove past the property twice before sunrise. Same make, same tint. They're circling, I said, waiting for us to make a mistake. He grunted. I'm more worried they'll try to cover theirs. I poured a cup of coffee, black and bitter. Then we make sure the paper speaks louder than they do. The next few days settled into a rhythm of quiet precision. I rebuilt what they'd tried to erase. Not the bridge, not yet, but the truth. Every photo, every document, every timestamp was cataloged twice, once in hard copy, once encrypted on a flash drive locked in the safe. I printed the bridge's federal registration again and signed the affidavit of current ownership beneath my grandfather's fading signature. Ink meeting ink across generations. By noon on Thursday, I was in my office, light slanting through the blinds, stacks of evidence fanned across the desk like cards waiting to be played. The law has its own music when it's done right. The soft scrape of paper, the click of a stapler, the rhythm of order. I worked to that rhythm all day, building the kind of case that doesn't shout but can't be ignored. Marcus stepped in, wiping his hands on a rag. Fence line's fixed, he said. What's next? I looked up from a manila folder labeled Lakeside Ridge Association. Next, we file the injunction. His brows rose. Already? They torched federal property. I'm not waiting for another fire to start. That evening, I called Hannah Thomas at the DOJ. Her voice came through steady but tired, the way people sound when they're trying to do good work inside a machine that resists it. Judge Remy, she said, I've reviewed your footage. The case has weight, federal weight, but it'll take coordination between agencies before we move. I understand coordination, I said, but understand this. They're still on my land. They're crews, they're surveyors. They're not stopping. She paused. Then you'll need to make them. Legally, I said. Of course, she replied, but make noise in the right places. File your injunction locally. We'll back it when it reaches our desk. After the call, I drafted the petition. Words like trespass, arson, and falsified jurisdiction filled the page. It was dry language, maybe, but I'd learned that justice didn't need to roar. It just had to be written clearly enough to echo. Later that night, Marcus and I walked the ridge where the shed had burned. The moon was sharp white, outlining the charred frame. He kicked at a piece of twisted metal. Think they'll come back? They'll try, I said. People like Bethany don't admit fault. They double down and hide behind bylaws. Marcus spit into the dirt. Bureaucrats with hammers. Exactly, I said, which means the only way to fight them is with better paper and steadier hands. We stood in silence for a long time. Somewhere below, the creek murmured, carrying bits of ash downstream. The following morning, I drove into Helena with the case folder beside me. The courthouse smelled like old pine and printer toner. When the clerk asked for my documents, I slid them forward and said quietly, emergency injunction, property dispute, federal registration attached. She took one look at the seal on the last page and raised her eyebrows. You're serious? I don't file jokes, Akshay said. By afternoon, it was official. The case Remy vs. Lakeside Ridge Association was logged into the county system, time-stamped, and sealed with the court's insignia. I had a copy printed on linen paper, the way my father used to do. I held it in my hand for a moment, before tucking it inside my coat pocket. That single document now weighed more than every threat they'd thrown at me combined. When I returned to the ranch, the air was still. The cameras blinked softly under the eaves. Marcus met me at the porch. Get it filed? I nodded. They can't lift a shovel or draw a new line now without violating a federal order. He smiled faintly. That'll slow them down. Maybe, I said. But silence isn't always retreat. Sometimes it's reload. That night, I sat at my desk again, the injunction lying under the lamplight. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, washing the ash from the ridge and the dust from the gravel road. The house felt heavy but safe, the kind of quiet that comes when everything has been prepared for what's next. The phone buzzed once more, a message from an unknown number. I opened it. A single line. "You think the law will save you, Judge?" We built the map. I stared at the screen until the rain swallowed the sound of my own breath. Then I placed the phone face down, picked up the fountain pen that had belonged to my grandfather, and wrote across the bottom of the injunction's copy. "Let them try." Outside, the rain quickened, tapping against the window like fingers impatient for justice. Outside, the rain quickened, tapping against the window like fingers impatient for justice. The clock on the wall ticked toward 5, the house holding its breath between night and morning. I hadn't slept. My mind turned over each detail: the letter, the fire, the map that wasn't a map but a claim. The rain eased just before sunrise, leaving the world washed raw. The hills shimmered with mist, fence lines black and slick. I brewed coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon upright, when headlights swept briefly across the porch. Marcus wasn't due back from the feed store until noon. Then came the knock. It wasn't timid. It was the kind of knock meant to be heard by anyone still pretending to sleep. I set down the mug, brushed the edge of the injunction with my hand, as if to remind myself what ground I stood on, and opened the door. A man in a pressed gray suit stood on the porch, clipboard under his arm. Rain beaded on his shoulders. "Good morning," he said, with the smooth confidence of someone who practiced saying it to strangers. "You must be Mr. Remy." "That depends who's asking." He smiled, too clean, too polite. "My name's Adam Price. I represent the Lakeside Ridge Association. I'm here to deliver a zoning proposal and notice of inclusion under community expansion." I let the words hang in the cool air. "Inclusion," I repeated. "That's an interesting word for trespass." He didn't blink. "Our records show your parcel borders the new district boundary. Under the amended charter, your property falls within the jurisdiction of Lakeside Ridge." "Amended by who?" "The board, of course." I looked past him. A dark SUV idled by the road, engine running. 2 silhouettes sat inside, motionless. I crossed my arms. "You came a long way to hand me a piece of paper you could have mailed." He hesitated, glancing back at the vehicle. Given recent misunderstandings, Mrs. Whitfield thought a face-to-face would be better. I stepped forward, rain dripping from the porch roof between us. "Tell Mrs. Whitfield I don't take meetings on my property. And tell her she's violating a federal injunction. You might want to read the morning docket before making your next delivery." He forced a thin smile. "I see. Well, I'll note your refusal. But you'll still receive the official copy by post. We're simply..." "Done," I said, and closed the door. Through the window, I watched him stand there a few seconds longer, the rain darkening his suit, before he turned and walked down the drive. The SUV backed up slow, tires crunching the wet gravel, then disappeared beyond the trees. Marcus arrived an hour later, his pickup rattling through puddles. "You get visitors?" he asked, unloading sacks of feed. "HOA courier," I said. "Delivered lies wrapped in laminate." He frowned. "They're still pushing. Harder than ever." We worked in silence, stacking hay bales, feeding these cattle. By mid-morning, the sky cleared, but tension sat heavy on the air, a storm waiting for a signal. I checked my phone. One new message, no number listed. "Did you think we'd stop at paper?" I saved the message, attached the timestamp to my evidence folder, and exhaled slow. They wanted fear, reaction. Instead, they'd get record keeping. After lunch, I drove to the sheriff's office. McKay met me on the steps, hat pulled low against the glare. "Heard they came knocking," he said. "They did," I replied, handing him a copy of the injunction. "And they're ignoring this." He read it, jaw tightening. "Looks solid. You want a patrol out by your place?" "Not yet. They'll twist it into harassment. Let's wait until they cross a clearer line." McKay nodded, folding the paper. "You always did like catching 'em with ink instead of handcuffs." "Easier to hold up in court," I said. On the way back, I stopped by the ridge. The blackened shed still smelled faintly of soot, but new grass was pushing through the char. I knelt, brushed the ash from a half-melted hinge, and caught a flash of something metallic buried shallow, a small square of aluminum. I dug it out. Stamped across it, beneath soot and scratches, were the letters Ridge Construction Co. The same name from Bethany's paperwork, the same contractor tied to the bridge's demolition. They hadn't just burned my shed, they'd left their signature. That evening, Marcus and I set up the final camera near the creek crossing. The sun dipped low, washing the valley in bronze. "Think they'll show tonight?" he asked. "They always do when they think no one's looking," I said. We sat in the barn with the laptop open, live feeds from 4 cameras glowing across the screen. Outside, night settled deep and blue. Hours passed. Then, motion. A figure stepped into view near the creek, flashlight low. Another followed, dragging something metallic. The lens adjusted, sharpening the scene. They were planting new stakes. Again. Marcus cursed under his breath. "That's them." I zoomed in. The reflection caught one man's face just enough to confirm it. Adam Price, the HOA's messenger, the one who'd smiled on my porch. He was driving the stake into the same soil that held the remains of my family's bridge. "Record everything," I said. We let them finish. When they drove away, I walked down to the creek with a camera of my own. The new stakes glowed orange under the moonlight. I knelt, took photos from 3 angles, then pulled the top stake free. Its tag read, HOA Boundary Adjustment, Pending Review. Back inside, I uploaded the footage and wrote the report for Hannah. Every image, every timestamp. When I finished, I leaned back and looked out the window. The cameras blinked softly, loyal sentinels across the dark. Somewhere beyond the ridge, headlights flickered once and vanished. The night went still, the kind of stillness that only comes before the storm changes its name. The next morning broke cold and bright, the kind of sharp light that feels like judgment. Mist clung to the low fields, and the burned patch on the ridge looked almost silver. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside the injunction papers. The evidence folder lay open, page corners curling. Everything was in place. Photos, timestamps, the video of the men staking new lines. Marcus came in wiping his hands on a rag. "Truck's ready if you're going to town," he said. I nodded. "It's time." He studied me a moment. "You sure you want to file it yourself? Could have your lawyer handle it." I don't hand off things that bear my family's name. By 8, the road was dry enough for the drive to Helena. The courthouse rose pale against the sky, stone steps worn by decades of boots. I walked through the doors with my coat collar turned up, the injunction sealed in a heavy envelope under my arm. Inside, the clerk recognized me before I said a word. She glanced at the name on the form and blinked. "You're filing against the HOA?" "I'm filing for the law," I said, sliding the documents across the counter. "The Lakeside Ridge Association has violated federal property protection codes, falsified boundaries, and engaged in arson." The clerk looked from me to the papers, then called for a deputy clerk to witness the timestamp. When the heavy stamp hit the page, Filed 9:17 a.m., Redwater County Court. I felt a quiet shift inside me, the way ground settles after rain. Outside, I dialed Hannah Thomas. She answered on the second ring. "Judge Remy," she said, voice taut. "We saw the footage. Headquarters is authorizing a joint investigation. You just gave us the anchor we needed." "How far can you go with it?" I asked. "As far as we have to. I'll coordinate with the marshals. Expect contact by the end of the week." When I hung up, the wind caught the courthouse flag and snapped it straight. The sound echoed down the steps like a gavel in open air. By the time I got back to the ranch, Marcus was on the porch, hat pulled low. "You hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" He tilted his head toward the pasture. In the distance, engines rumbled. 3, maybe 4 vehicles. Dust rose along the ridge road. I stepped to the edge of the porch and watched as a convoy of black trucks rolled up to the property line. On the side doors, the HOA crest shimmered in gold leaf. "Well," Marcus muttered, "looks like Bethany's doubling down." We walked to the gate. The lead truck stopped, and a woman in sunglasses stepped out. Bethany Whitfield. Her blazer was too bright for ranch country. Her shoes too clean for the dirt she was standing on. "Mr. Remy," she said, voice sweet as varnish. "We received your notice." "Bold move." "It's not a move," I said. "It's a correction." She held up a clipboard. "You're in violation of multiple community standards. Non-compliance with zoning updates. Obstruction of development access." "Stop," I said quietly. "You're on federal land now, Bethany. Every step you take here is evidence." Her smile flickered. "You're bluffing." "Try me." Behind her, one of her men whispered something, pointing toward the cameras mounted along the fence posts. She looked up, saw the red light blinking, and her jaw tightened. "This isn't over," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's just beginning." They left without another word, the convoy stirring dust across the valley. I stood until the last truck vanished over the hill, then turned back toward the porch. Marcus shook his head. "She's unraveling. That's what happens when power meets paper." That night, the air was heavy with heat lightning. I sat at the desk, drafting the final affidavit for the DOJ. My handwriting stayed steady even as thunder rolled in the distance. Each paragraph was another nail in the coffin of her arrogance. Around midnight, I heard a vehicle pull up outside. Not HOA this time, a government sedan. I opened the door to find a man in a dark coat holding an envelope. "Marshal Wilkins," he said, flashing his badge. "We've got your case on record. Washington's interested." He stepped inside, glanced over the folders spread across the desk, and whistled low. "You weren't kidding. This is airtight." "It has to be," I said. "They've been hiding behind bylaws long enough." Wilkins nodded. "We'll move fast. Once the injunction's read into the docket, they can't touch an inch of this land without facing federal charges." The next morning, the story broke wide. Local radio, then state news. Federal judge files case against HOA over destroyed landmark bridge. I didn't say a word to reporters who called, but the phones at the county office rang all day. By sunset, I stood again at the creek. The water was calm, low, glinting gold under the fading light. The stakes they'd driven were still there, but now they meant something else. Markers not of ownership, but of evidence. Marcus joined me, hands on his hips. "So it's official. The court's moving?" "It's in the system," I said, "and the system has a long memory." He looked across the field, where storm clouds gathered over the far ridge. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "we wait for the sound of the gavel." The first raindrops hit the surface of the creek, dimpling the reflection of the sky. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder rolled again, deep and patient, just like justice taking its time to arrive. By the next morning, The rain had passed, and the valley gleamed as though scrubbed clean. Steam lifted off the roads, and the cottonwoods stood still and silver in the damp air. The courthouse sat quiet under a washed blue sky, its flag stirring slow in the breeze. I parked out front and checked my watch. 8:42. The hearing was scheduled for 9. Inside, the marble floors reflected every step. A line of reporters waited near the door, their cameras low but their curiosity loud. I gave them nothing, just a nod to the bailiff and a brief word with my attorney, Ethan Grant, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of calm itself. He carried the case file under his arm, edges squared, papers aligned like soldiers ready for review. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since they drove that first stake into my land." We entered the courtroom. It smelled faintly of dust and varnish, the scent of stories decided and forgotten. The gallery was already half full, ranchers, local residents, a few members of the HOA board pretending they weren't nervous. Bethany Whitfield sat in the front row beside her lawyer, a man in an expensive gray suit who whispered into her ear as if words could still save her. She turned once, her eyes finding mine. Her smile was gone now. Judge Janet Miller entered, the bailiff's voice echoing through the room. We stood. She'd been a colleague years ago, long before either of us had titles worth remembering. When she met my eyes, her expression was cool but knowing. "This hearing," she began, "concerns the motion for an emergency injunction against the Lakeside Ridge Association, filed by Mr. Jacob Remy, in response to allegations of illegal demolition, trespass, and boundary fraud." Her voice carried the weight of order, the kind that silences even arrogance. Ethan stood first, smooth as water over stone. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client's property lies outside the jurisdiction of Lakeside Ridge, yet the association acted with impunity, demolishing a federally protected structure and falsifying zoning documents to justify it. These are not mistakes, they are deliberate acts." He handed over a packet of exhibits, photographs of the destroyed bridge, the orange signs, the trail cam footage, the fake boundary map, each one projected onto the screen behind him. The images filled the room with silence. Bethany's lawyer rose next. "Your Honor," he began, "while we understand Mr. Remy's frustration, this is a misunderstanding of administrative boundaries. The association believed the land in question to be within community limits based on a clerical. Judge Miller's tone cut clean through the word. "Your clients demolished a registered structure. Clerical errors don't use power tools." A ripple of laughter from the gallery died quickly under her look. Ethan continued. "We also present recorded evidence showing agents of the HOA trespassing and attempting to remap the property at night. My client's surveillance captured their activity. Furthermore, an accelerant was found at the scene of a subsequent fire, and fragments from Ridge Construction, the HOA's contracted developer, were recovered from the site." He paused, letting the photographs of the burned shed appear on the screen. The smell of charred wood seemed to drift back into the room, even from memory. Bethany's lawyer shuffled papers, his voice tight. "Your Honor, there's no proof connecting my clients to that incident." Ethan smiled faintly. "The accelerant container was traced to a purchase order signed by the same contractor that handled the bridge demolition." Bethany whispered something harsh to her counsel. Her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted her bracelet. Judge Miller leaned back in her chair. "I've heard enough." She looked at me directly. "Mr. Remy, is it your testimony that these events occurred on your registered land?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have the deed and federal registration number on record." I handed her the document, the one my grandfather had signed 60 years ago, its paper yellowed but intact. She studied it, then looked over her glasses. "You've kept this a long time." "My family's built bridges longer than most people have built fences," I said. A quiet murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Miller closed the file, the sound like a door shutting on an era. This court grants the emergency injunction. Effective immediately, the Lakeside Ridge Association is ordered to cease all activity involving Mr. Remy's property. Any further encroachment, physical or administrative, will be treated as a federal violation under preservation law. Bethany's lawyer started to object, but she raised a hand. "Don't," she said. "I'm not in the mood for theater." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. As we exited, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward like weapons of curiosity. "Mr. Remy, how does it feel?" one asked. "Like the beginning," I said, walking past. Outside, the air was bright and alive, the kind of day that feels newly written. Marcus waited by the truck, grinning like a man who'd bet on the right horse all along. "So?" "Injunctions granted," I said. "They can't move an inch now without digging their own grave." He slapped the side of the truck. "Told you paper beats muscle." As we pulled out of the courthouse lot, the radio crackled with the afternoon news. The story had already made state headlines. Local HOA under federal injunction after destruction of historic bridge. But the victory didn't feel clean. The quiet on the drive home carried weight. Clouds were gathering again over the hills, their edges dark as bruises. I knew Bethany wouldn't surrender. People like her never did. They just looked for new doors to kick open. When we reached the ranch, I stepped out to the smell of wet, sage and the hum of crickets. The cameras blinked steady across the field. For the first time in weeks, the air felt safe, but only for a moment. Because as dusk settled over the valley, a new sound rolled across the land, the distant groan of diesel engines. I turned toward the ridge. In the last light of evening, I saw them, 2 bulldozers crawling down the far hill, floodlights cutting through the dark. Marcus came to my side, eyes wide. "They're going for the rebuild site," he said. I took a deep breath, calm and cold. Then they just broke a federal order. Thunder cracked again over the valley, closer now, as if the storm had finally found its mark. I took a deep breath, calm and cold. Then they just broke a federal order. Thunder cracked again over the valley, closer now, as if the storm had finally found its mark. The bulldozers moved like beasts in the dusk, their headlights sweeping across the ridge, turning the creek's mist into a wall of pale fire. The engines roared louder as they descended, chewing at the soil, their blades flashing in the lightning. Marcus stepped forward. "You want me to stop them?" "No," I said. "The law will." I went back inside, dialed Marshal Wilkins. The line picked up on the second ring, his voice clear over the hum of storm static. "Wilkins here." "They're here," I said. 2 bulldozers on federal land, pushing through a filed injunction. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Stay put. Don't confront them. We're 30 minutes out." "Make it 20, I replied. I hung up and watched from the porch as the machines reached the edge of the creek. Their floodlights hit the old abutments, the remnants of my grandfather's bridge still standing like bones. I could see Bethany Whitfield's silhouette in a white raincoat beside one of the trucks, gesturing to her crew through the downpour. Marcus clenched his fists. "She's insane." "No," I said, eyes fixed on her. "She's desperate." Lightning flashed again, painting her in silver and shadow. She shouted something at the operator, and the bulldozer's blade lowered. The first shove of dirt hit the water with a hiss. "Camera," I said. Marcus handed me the high-resolution recorder we'd set up for exactly this. I zoomed in, steady, capturing every motion, every command she gave. Evidence doesn't care about emotion. It only cares about clarity. At 8:47 p.m., the bulldozers crossed the line, literally. The left machine ground through the flagged boundary post with a metallic shriek, sparks flying off the steel. The creek water splashed up the tracks, swallowing their reflection. I hit record on my phone too, backing up the footage twice. 10 minutes later, a distant wail joined the storm, the sound of approaching sirens. Blue and red lights began flickering through the trees, growing brighter. Bethany turned, her face tightening as she realized what was coming. The first federal vehicle skidded to a halt on the ridge road. Doors slammed. 4 marshals stepped out, coats snapping in the wind. Wilkins led them, his badge glinting under the rain. He raised a loudspeaker. "Mrs. Whitfield, step away from the equipment. You are in violation of a federal injunction and trespassing on protected land." Bethany shouted something inaudible back, but I caught the defiance in her posture. She waved her clipboard, rain pouring off her sleeve. "You don't have jurisdiction here," Wilkins's voice came back like thunder. "You're standing on the proof that we do." The bulldozers idled uncertainly. One operator cut the engine, glancing between the marshals and Bethany. She slapped the side of the machine, screaming over the storm. "Keep going." But no one moved. The second operator climbed down, tossing his gloves into the mud. When the first followed, the night seemed to exhale. Wilkins and 2 deputies approached Bethany. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you're under arrest for contempt of court, obstruction of justice, and willful destruction of protected property." Her expression cracked, disbelief cutting through arrogance. "You can't do this," she spat. Wilkins met her eyes. "Watch me." He read her rights under the hiss of rain. When he placed the cuffs on her wrists, the flash of lightning caught the silver like a verdict. I stayed back, camera still rolling. There was no satisfaction in watching it, only a strange, quiet relief, like seeing a wound finally cleaned. By the time the convoy left with Bethany in custody, the storm had passed. The valley steamed under the sudden calm, and the water in the creek ran dark and full, washing away the dirt her machines had spilled. Marcus broke the silence first. "You did it, Jake." "Not yet," I said softly. "She's just the hand. Someone else built the hammer." He frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning I've seen money move behind silence before." I looked at the demolished posts, the half-buried tracks, the equipment left behind like carcasses. The HOA doesn't have the kind of backing to gamble on federal land. Someone bigger's been feeding them. Later that night, as the marshals finished securing the site, Wilkins came to the porch. His coat dripped water onto the boards. "You were right," he said. "We found documents in her truck, contracts, offshore transfers, a shell company in Miami funneling funds through the HOA. The DOJ's launching a RICO investigation by morning." I exhaled slowly. "That's the hammer." Wilkins nodded. "And you just hit it back." When he left, the ranch settled into silence again. The stars had returned, hard and bright against the wet sky. I walked down to the creek. The water had calmed, curling gently around the remnants of the bridge, its surface carrying pieces of bark and ash away into the distance. I crouched there for a while, the cold seeping through my jeans, the smell of rain thick in the air. This fight had started with a bridge and a lie, but it was ending with a truth too big to bury. Marcus called from the porch, "You coming in?" "In a minute." I stood, watching the reflection of the moon in the slow water. The cameras blinked quietly behind me, still recording, still remembering. Justice, I thought, doesn't rush. It waits for its own weather. And tonight, the sky was finally clearing. Morning came bright and almost unreal, the kind of morning that smells like clean wood and wet earth. The air had that after-storm hush, as if the world itself were holding a breath it didn't know it was keeping. The ridge looked softer now, washed in gold. Marcus met me by the fence, thermos in hand. "They towed the machines off before sunrise," he said. Left the field cleaner than a sermon. I nodded. They won't be back. Word of the arrests spread faster than wildfire ever could. By noon, the local paper ran a headline that caught like a spark. HOA president charged in federal land fraud. Cameras appeared on the road again, but this time they stayed on the right side of the fence. Folks slowed their trucks just to wave or shout a few words of thanks. But the thing that mattered most wasn't the noise. It was the silence returning to the land. The honest kind, not the kind that hides behind polished glass and paperwork. 2 weeks later, under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, construction began on the new bridge. Not a corporate crew, not a contracted company. Neighbors, ranchers, retired carpenters, and even a few of the same men who had once doubted my fight showed up with tool belts and thermoses. Marcus organized the lumber. I handled the plans. The blueprints were taken straight from my grandfather's originals, copied line for line. The sound of hammers filled the valley, rhythm steady as heartbeat. The smell of cut pine mingled with the breeze. One afternoon, a group of high school students from town came to help sand the decking. Their teacher explained they were studying civic history. I laughed and told them they were standing in it. As the days passed, the frame rose from the water like something the land had been missing. The posts went in clean, the planks laid tight. I carved a small piece of brass myself, a plaque with my grandfather's words. May this bridge keep our family connected, no matter the storms. When the last nail went in, the sun was setting low, painting the boards honey-colored. Marcus handed me a small box. "Thought you might want the honors," he said. Inside was a single golden nail engraved with the date. I placed it in the center beam, tapped it once, twice, then drove it home. The ring of metal on wood echoed across the valley, deep and final, the sound of something being set right. Reporters asked for statements. I gave none. The land itself was enough of one. The Department of Justice released a brief note confirming the arrests, the RICO charges, and a list of connected developers now under investigation across 4 states. Bethany's name was there among them, smaller now than it had ever appeared in print. The following Sunday, folks from across the county gathered for a quiet ceremony. No podiums, no speeches, just the bridge, the creek, and the people who'd lived by both. Kids ran across the new span, their laughter mixing with the steady murmur of water. The old and the young stood side by side, hands tucked into pockets, faces warmed by late sunlight. When it was over, I stayed behind. The crowd faded up the hill, their voices dimming into evening. The water beneath the bridge whispered soft and constant, carrying silt and memory. I leaned on the railing, feeling the grain of the wood under my palms. Marcus came up beside me. "You ever think about selling now that it's over?" he asked, half teasing. I smiled. "They offered once, remember? Enough to buy 10 ranches. And?" I looked at the bridge, the way it caught the light, the way it stood exactly where it belonged. "And I wouldn't trade this piece of ground for all the gold in Texas." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Knew you'd say that." The sun slipped below the ridge, leaving the sky streaked in amber and rose. The creek glowed like liquid glass, reflecting the bridge and the mountains beyond. For the first time in months, the horizon looked peaceful, whole. That night, back at the house, I sat by the window, listening to the quiet creak of wood settling after a long day. On the desk lay the final report from Judge Miller's court. Case closed, injunction upheld, full restitution granted. The last line read, "Lakeside Ridge Association dissolved by order of the court." I folded the paper and set it aside. Outside, the wind moved gently through the cottonwoods. This fight had begun with anger, sharp, cold, necessary, but it ended with something steadier, peace. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that lets it rest. I stepped onto the porch. The moon hung over the valley, pale and watchful. Down by the creek, the bridge gleamed faintly in the silver light, its reflection unbroken. The land was quiet again. And in that quiet, I heard everything that mattered: the hum of the water, the breath of the hills, the faint echo of a hammer striking home. Some bridges, I thought, aren't built to cross. They're built to remind. If you've ever had to fight for what's yours, you know, justice takes patience, but it's worth every step. Drop a justice in the comments if you've ever stood your ground against unfair rules or folks who went too far. And if stories like this remind you what it means to hold your own out here, hit subscribe, stay a while. There are more tales of land, grit, and quiet redemption coming down the trail.